Okay, this video is going to be how to UV unwrap a few different objects that might be something you guys encounter. So this first object, we have a wooden boat, and so each of these pieces should feel like a plank of wood. So what's going to be really important for this is that the wood grain follows that shape logically to how it might be built. Okay, so looking at some references, I found a couple pictures of boats. So here's my texture image I'm using just as an example. And then here we can see I was looking at a couple different references and just noticing that the wood grain is following the shape of the plank of wood. Even if it is bending upwards, it's still following, the wood grain's following that shape. And that tells me that for the most part, it's a piece of wood that was straight and then bent up into place, and then using some kind of, I don't know, magical boat building techniques, they warped it into place and made it hold its position. Also, what's important is noticing what different pieces of wood are. So like these are obviously different pieces of planks of wood, but also like looking at this top piece, this is a separate plank of wood. I can see that grain. I can see where it joins right here. It's going to be different piece of wood from this one over here. So I want it to feel, I probably need to cut the UVs right around there, ignoring this little nose part that pops up. But those two sides that meet together, right where they meet together, I'm probably going to want to cut there too. And then in between those two pieces, there's planks of wood that go across. So you can see plank of wood, and then kind of a funky shaped plank of wood. So it's really important to observe how this might be built. Also have, let's see, door frame wood. So I've noticed this too many times with students' projects. For something like this, like a wooden door frame, right, which is just essentially like the most simple one, is just three pieces of wood that are, you have a top and then two side pieces. Let's go to this image. Right, now this is a plastic one, but you can see they clearly like tried to make it look like it's real. But typically it's like a piece, you have a piece of wood here, then you have a 50 or 45 degree joint, and you have another piece of wood here, another plank, and so the grain, watching how it follows that shape. In this case, it makes it look like that this whole door was started from a couple planks of wood that were glued together and then sanded down, and then carved out the designs out of that combination. So here's another viewpoint. So we can see there we have a piece of wood, and then there's where that joint is. So we got to think about that for any of our objects we're making, especially something that's like made of wood. Is how are you making it? How would someone construct that realistically, right? We can't just make everything a single piece of wood and then just have all of the wood grain just like go in all kinds of different directions, right? It has to kind of make sense and feel right. I didn't share what example people usually do that's wrong, but what I've noticed usually is that someone might treat someone who does this wrong, they'll treat this whole door frame, right, the outside part, as one object, and then they'll just slap on a texture, scale it to the correct size. But the problem is the wood grain will work in one direction, but in a different part it doesn't work, right? So the wood grain would be going upwards up here instead of going across. So it's important that we kind of, what we want to do, at least for this wood object, is we want to kind of start breaking up the UVs, or you can do individualized textures. That's by rotating texture maps to fit. Either way, we'll just want to make sure that the wood grain follows the direction of our UV layout. Okay. So in my case, I have a texture that's fixed, right? So it's a texture that I'm not going to be manipulating and changing around, right? That I want to repeat. So I need to make my UVs match the shape of the texture, or match the orientation of the texture, so that it feels like the grain is going in the right direction, like I have kind of like here. The alternative would be to, lay out your UVs so you have as little distortion as possible, and then instead manipulate your UV or your texture maps so that the texture matches the layout of the UV better. So let's take a look at that here. So I had it, there we go. So I'm going to start with this object right here. I'm going to isolate it by pressing Control 1. I'll restart this in a second. This is after I already messed with it. But if I bring in my image, so I'm going to go image display, make sure I don't have checker map turned on. You can see this is my my texture map, right? And so that wood grain is going from right to left. So I want my object, the length of it, to kind of follow that right to left, right? Obviously, if I went this direction, that would not look correct because that wood grain is not following the plank length like all my examples. It's going the opposite direction, right? So anyways, let me go ahead and start with just default textures. So what I'm going to do is almost always my simplest method of, or in my opinion, the simplest way of unwrapping any object in Maya is just to take it, go to create a new planar projection. So just create planar, right? And so it's just going to weld it all together and flatten it out. It's not usable right now, but it just gives us a nice starting point that's easy to work with. And then go in and figure out how I'm going to cut it up, right? And that's a more complicated topic that I'm not going to cover here. But in this case, I'm going to be looking at seams, one that's going to help with unfolding, and two that would help me, or would be logical places for me to make this object out of multiple different pieces of wood, right? So for instance, I might find that's a good spot for like my 45-degree joint right there, where this could be a separate piece of wood and this could be a separate piece of wood. So I'd want to do something like that. This plank right here should be separate from this kind of extrusion piece up here, theoretically, right? Might be different depending on who's making the boat. So I'll find like a way that I can separate this top plank object here from this side plank. Same thing with this bottom plank here from this side plank. Obviously this back plank, I'm kind of wanting to, this will be a different piece of wood. Okay, just looking around. And so this, in a lot of ways, being able to cut it up this many times is going to make it easier for me because I'm going to have less distortion. So the less pieces you have connected, the less distortion you're going to have. But because I'm going to be like straightening and changing and hurting or twisting the shape of this object to match the texture, I'm going to get distortion no matter what. So it's going to kind of balance itself out. I'm going to go ahead and hide that texture just because it'll be harder to see. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut it. So modify, cut, no, it's cut, so cut. All right, and then I'll just take my UV shells and I'm going to lay them, go ahead and unfold them and lay them out. So I'll go unfold, I'll go modify layout. So my favorite layout settings is to use shell prescaling. So right here, shell prescaling, setting that to preserve 3D ratios. What that's going to do is it's going to scale all of my shells so that their size relationship between each other is similar to their 3D space size relationship. So if one part of my mesh is 2 times as large as another part of my mesh, the layout or the UV shell for that is going to be 2 times as large as the UV layout for the other part. Okay, so I'll just click apply. And I'll also let it translate. I sometimes let it rotate and have it make sure it's not stacking and make sure there's no overlapping. Okay, so I'll just click apply. Okay, so this isn't going to be this isn't a great layout, to be honest, because I could really maximize the space much better. But at least what I know is, let's turn on checkerboard so we can see it. And I can just take all these and just scale them up so we can see the checkerboards a little bit smaller. At least because I set that shell prescaling so that they're all kind of relatively the same size, I can see in 3D that the texel size or the texture size of all these UV shells are exactly the same, right? So they're all, like, all these squares are going to be exactly the same size between all these objects, which is 100% something you want. You do not want, one object to, let's grab this object. I don't want it to be like this, right? Where like there's a significant difference in size, or this is called texels, right? So essentially the amount of visual space in the UV coordinates that essentially like a UV shell is taking up. So you can see this one's taking up very little space compared to these pieces, right? And you can see, and that's relative to their size in the 3D world too. So you can see this guy needs a lot more texel space. And if I turn that on, actually you don't really see the distortion actually. But you can see, so I want those objects to be the same size. So I'm just going to grab them, or those squares to be the same size. So I'll just go to that, modify layouts, and with that shell prescaling. Okay. so now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to scale any of these guys. I'm going to scale them again later because I can just relay it out anytime I want to. I'm just going to drag these guys out of the way just because I kind of like to make it as simple as I can. Let's turn off that checkerboard for a second. All right, so first things first, right? The grain is going left to right, so I need it to follow the length of my my board, and it's not, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate that. So I'll just hold J to rotate in 15-degree increments, and just get that kind of like that. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little, I'm going to be warping this and then unfolding or optimizing it so that the object tries to conform to a shape I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to enforce a straight shape, and so that the rest of the, so that I can get this to kind of, because if I can get this whole object going straight in a line, or as opposed to straight in a line, then that texture is going to follow that, that shape of that object, right? Because right now you can see it goes straight. Let's go pull that to the side. So the texture goes straight, but then it just goes off, right? When in reality, because it's a plank of wood, I want that grain to follow the length of this, so those lines to kind of follow the length of it. So what I do is I'm going to grab this. So I'm going to have to find just like a happy medium. So I'm going to actually grab this middle line right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it down. So this is essentially, I'm just straightening it, so it's just a straight line now. Let's go to flat shaded mode, because there's a little distortion that was going on there. And now that I've got it into this position, I'm first going to unfold it in one direction, because by scaling this down, right, I'm actually shortening these lines, right? So these lines that are not straight and they're like kind of tilted upwards, they have a longer length because, you know, compared to like in its current position, like look at this edge right here, we can even, I'm just going to snap this over here. So this edge right here, and when it's at this angle, it's longer than it is at this angle when I flatten it, because all that's happening is it's just dragging this point straight down. So this is actually getting shorter because I'm losing the y-axis component of that length. So what I'll do is I'll straighten it out, and then I'll unfold it in the u-axis. And it doesn't look like it really did anything, to be honest. Let's go to UVs. Okay. Let's just grab all these guys. Oop. There we go. And let's try unfolding the U. Okay, so it didn't really want to unfold it. All right, so now what I'm going to do is, now this is going to be my, kind of like my this is the line I'm using to teach the rest of this UV shell to conform to, right? So I straighten this out, and then I'm going to go ahead and pin it. You'll see it turns blue. So now what I can do is I can grab this UV shell, I go modify, unfold, and what it's going to do is it's going to actually unfold that entire, it's going to do another unfold operation, but it's going to understand that this needs to be straight. So it's going to unfold the rest of the UV shell around it. And I'm going to have some distortion that I'm going to try to fix in a second. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this. So now you can see that the grain is actually following the length of that plank, right? So it's actually following the length of that plank because I am lining up this middle edge, this one right here, with that texture map that I have. So this right here, I'm just realizing I might have been doing stuff on my second monitor, and that might have been something you couldn't have seen. So let me go ahead and view that image. Right, so I'm trying to line up I'm lining up one of my actual edges more or less with my texture map. So everything else is kind of obeying. You can see that, you know, I'm going to have a little curvature to it. So in this case, I'm kind of balancing, you know, my UV, or like, you know, making my UVs follow my texture map, and also trying to minimize distortion, right? Because what I could do is I could actually theoretically like straighten all of these lines, right? So I can grab this one, just make sure I got it in UV mode. Right, so I can grab this line, straighten it, and then pin it. And then maybe this line, straighten it, pin it. All right, and then maybe I'll unpin this middle one for a second. Let's just drag this one. Okay, I'll just unpin that one. Okay, and so I'll just grab my UV shell, modify, unfold. And so, I mean, ignoring the, I can just fix that really easily. Ignoring the distortion for a second, right? Like that probably is more straight, right? And so I'm probably, it's going to be a little bit more accurate in terms of like straight and following along, but you'll see my texture is actually changing size as it goes along, right? Because this part up here is actually thinner or smaller than this part down here. So that's kind of tricky. I can turn on the checkerboard, right? Let's select that guy, right? You can see these squares down here are bigger than these squares up here. So, you know, I think that's probably something I don't want. So in that case, I probably wouldn't go that far with that texture unwrapping, or with that straightening of my object. So I'm just going to Control Z back. And let me just go ahead and unpin it and just do it a second time. So unpin, modify, unfold. So here's my default. I'm just going to grab, let's go ahead and, it's best to try to get the shell to kind of get in as best in position as you can. So I'll kind of bring it to like right here. Okay, grab UV mode, select an edge based on UVs. There we go. Straighten it, pin it. And I'm just scaling it to straighten it. And then grabbing that, going to modify, unfold. Okay. So that just forces the unfolding around that straight edge. And then what I'd do is I'd probably go ahead and unpin it. And let's take a look at the distortion, because there's definitely going to be some distortion. It might be kind of hard to see, to be honest. But there's going to be, you can see there's a little bit of distortion. You can see that color changing to blue right there. It's so minimal that it's probably not even worth worrying about. There's red and blue right there, but I can do a little bit better. So I'm just going to grab this UV shell. I'm going to unfold it in a single axis, the U axis, which is like the X axis. So I'll just click on that. You can see that kind of improves that little bulging that happens when I have a pin, edge pinned and everything else is trying to unfold around it. So I'll just unfold along the U axis, and beautiful. Okay, so let's take a look at that again. So I probably, I should probably check my checkerboard to see if I have, oops, and I'll turn off the distortion view. There we go. So it looks like the checkerboard's actually pretty similar in size. So yeah, in my case, I probably would rather that, you know, the checkerboards in this case are relatively the same size from the back to the front of it, then I would worry about getting that grain completely inside, right? So you'll see it actually kind of cuts off at some parts. You see that? How the grain kind of runs off, but it's still kind of following that shape more or less. So it's just kind of like what I'm going to live with and view as acceptable. I'm not going to worry about the other side because I can just probably mirror it in a second. All right, so this bottom part, so I probably don't need to cut this little knob back here off, so I'll go ahead and weld these guys back on together. Let me turn off that checkerboard so it's easier to look at. Okay, so I'll just weld this guy back together. So I'll go to move and sew or stitch together, either one's fine. I think the rest of those are looking good. There's probably a piece on the front I might need to worry about. No, okay. So the end of this actually, to be honest, you know, I actually might want to cut this off, right? Because, you know, the end of the grain, you know, the end grain of this, imagine this as a 2x4 and I cut it in half or cut a section off, right? This texture would be very different than the grain of this texture along its length, right? Because I'm looking at the cross section of it. Cross section cut of 2x4. Let's take a look at that. I don't know how to actually Google this, but here's an image, right? So the you know, that texture layout is way different along the length versus along the cross section of it, right? I'm not a woodworker, so you can see that right there. So that's kind of nice. You could have it so it wraps around, because getting those lines to line up would be a little tricky. But you know, I might also just want to cut it off and just treat it differently. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and just I'll just cut it off. So I'll just go to cut. Okay. I don't know if it's the right choice, but that's what I'm doing. So this one looks like it's going to be pretty easy to do. So this one's good. So I'll just kind of move it over to an area where I know it's safe, or I know I'm kind of done with it. So I'll just grab this one. Let's go to modify, unfold. Okay. And this one actually looks like it's going to be really easy. So I'm just going to kind of rotate it to line up. Something that I can do too is you can see I'm trying to rotate it with J to get, well, actually it turns out pretty good, but you know, if I try to rotate with J, like you might be trying to line up like an edge perfectly, but it's not. Something you can do with the UV editor is you can, if you want to like get an edge or align your object so it goes perfectly up or down with like going along the V axis or U axis or the X and Y axis, you can just select an edge and then you can go to, where are you? Align, no, not align, it is arrange. Yeah, orient to edges. So you can see it's going to take that edge I have selected and it's going to rotate the whole shell so that edge is completely lined up with that like flat in this axis. Okay, and so let's go ahead and take a look at this texture. And so it's probably way too small, so I'm going to scale it up, right? Because it's kind of hard to see the texture on here. It's also kind of a low resolution image. It's probably not the best image. It's not the texture I would use because you can see that repeating going on. But you can see that the grain is following that shape more or less. It's not perfectly. You can see it's kind of going off a little bit. So what I might want to do is I might want to select that, and then I might need to do something similar to what I did with the side plank, where I go ahead and make sure I flatten out that edge, pin it. So let's go ahead and convert it to UVs. Pin it. Okay, so this happened earlier on pin all, as it would not pin sometimes. I don't know what's exactly causing it. But what I would want to do is I would want to go ahead and pin it and then do the unfold around it just like I did with that piece right there. So I'm going to select this and I'm going to go ahead and I got a little funny wiggling going on right there. Oh, there it is. It doesn't show up in smooth shaded mode. Okay, that's good to know. So then I'll just grab my UV shell here and then go modify, unfold, and hope that works. I could try straightening it a little bit more like I was kind of showing on the previous one. So actually let's try doing that. So not just the middle part, but the top and bottom parts. So I'll just grab these guys, make sure I'm doing UVs. Oh, so I'll grab this guy. Okay, so I'll probably have to manually select this so it doesn't select the entire boundary. Okay. All right, scale that down flat, do this, and then go ahead and pin it, and then do the bottom. Okay, scale it down flat. Okay, then I will pin it. Okay, grab my UV shell, and then I'll just unfold it, and then unpin everything. So unpin everything. You can see I got all that distortion right there. That's caused by those pin edges holding, but everything else trying to push out to relax. And I'll just unfold in the U axis to kind of help it out a little bit. If I want to kind of further let it relax a little bit back to its original shape, I can use optimize. So optimize is going to try to, it's not going to do quite an unfold, right? Because if you do an unfold operation, it's going to kind of like, you know, redo everything, like, you know, redo your unfolding. So everything you kind of modify and tweak is going to be lost. So optimize is going to be kind of like somewhere in between. It's going to sort of do a little bit of relaxing so that it minimizes distortion. You can come in here and you can make it so, you know, the less power. I'm not as familiar with these settings, but I'm imagining the less power you use, the less it's going to tweak that shape. You can probably keep applying it. Maybe pull it up a little bit. Oh, yeah, so 100% power I don't really like because it really goes back to its previous version. But it doesn't like anything less than that. So let's see if I can do 100, a less surf angle. Yeah, I really don't know these settings that well, to be honest. Less surf angle seems like to do it, so it still kind of has that shape. So I'll grab that, let's close that. And I'll go back out and look at this to take a look at that. And let's turn off that grid so it doesn't get in the way. Yeah, so I might need to still orient it because it still feels like it's angled weird, which I don't really understand. Because you can see it kind of feels like it's going from this side to that side. And actually that might just be a matter of my texture map not being completely straight. So I go to my texture, image display. All right, So I can see here actually that you can see that texture is curving upwards, so it goes straight. It's not going straight. So that's just a matter of my texture map not being straight at that location. So I might be able to try it down here. Maybe it's straighter down here. Yeah, that looks way better. Still get a little curvature, but I want to fix that in my texture map to get it straight. Okay, so that was the main problem with that one. Right, and so I just keep doing that across the whole object. I mean, this back piece right here is probably going to be the easiest part to UV unwrap. I'm just going to grab this and go modify, unfold, and I might just straighten it out. So let's go ahead and pull it. We'll just pull it up here. Let's get this guy out of the way for a second. I'll grab this guy. And I'm just going to grab an edge and just do that trick I showed earlier under Arrange and Layout. Just orient the edges to straighten it out. And let's get rid of the Dreamtime logo for a second. So, I might have to modify the textures on this one to make it look like it's made of like maybe 3 planks of wood instead of like a single plank of wood. But that makes sense to me that that back part right there would just be like a couple planks of wood going across this way. And yeah, so I would do the same thing on the bottom and the side piece right here as I do on the top right here. And then I would just probably, personally, if I was doing this, I'd just re-mirror this. So actually, let me go ahead and do that top part. So I'll just grab, actually I have 2 more pieces I need to do. I need to do this piece right here and this piece right here. So I'll start with this piece. Pull that over to the side. You can see I'm scaling these up. I'm mostly scaling up just so I can see the texture better. When I do my layout again, it's not going to matter. These will go back to being scaled correctly when I use that shell pre-scaling. So I'm just going to come in here. Same thing, just grab a middle edge. Let's go to UV mode, make sure we're doing UV mode. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and straighten it. And then pin it. And then go to UV shell, unfold. Okay, that one has a lot of distortion, which is a little weird. Let's try unfolding it again. That was very strange. So let's go ahead and unpin. And then let's see if we can optimize it a little bit. So it's pretty straight. Let me take a look at that. Let's try unfolding along the U first. Okay, let's try just doing it that way and see if that looks better. So this one is that piece right there. Let's go to object mode. Okay, so I can see sometimes with this texture, since it's so low res, I might just use checkerboard instead. So let's go to select this object. And I just want to make sure that those lines are following the length of this and that the squares are relatively the same size from over here to over here. And to me, it looks like that's the case. You can see those squares are orienting and following the shape of this object compared to over here where they're just going straight. Okay, and let's do this back piece right here. I'm not going to worry about that piece down there. That's pretty easy. Okay, I'm going to select this one. Same thing as I did before. Scale it up. Just kind of rotate into place. I can just grab an edge and orient it to edges to straighten it, or align my object so that this edge lines up with this axis. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and actually this one looks pretty darn straight. I don't think this one's going to have a problem. Like all the ones that are pretty much straight objects are going to be really easy to work with. And you probably don't even need to do what I'm doing here. So I'll go ahead and pin it. UV shell, unfold. Okay, and unfold in the U axis. And I think that's pretty much as good as it's going to get. So I'm going to unpin that one. Okay. And I can see that, yeah, those follow along there. Okay, cool. So that's pretty straightforward. So now let's go ahead and mirror it. I just want to cover the mirroring just because I think there's some things that people forget or might not notice. So let's go ahead and turn off that. So I'm going to go ahead and a couple things I can do is to delete half of my object. What I can do is I can go, like I like this side, I don't like this side, so I'm going to delete this side. So I'm going to find my center line. Hopefully you have a center line on your object. I'm going to go hold Shift, right click, and then choose Detach Components. And what that's going to do is along that edge loop that I've selected, it's going to detach my object into separate pieces. So So I can go over to face mode, and I can double click on this side over here, and you can see now it actually cut this into two separate pieces of geometry along the edge I selected when I did shift right click, detach edges, or components when I have edges selected. I'll just select that, delete it. Okay, select my object, and I'm gonna go to mesh, mirror. Okay, oh, let me make sure I'm not hidden. There you go. Mesh, mirror, and no cut geometry. You can see I'm starting to get some welding going on up there, so I'm going to turn off, I'm going to bring my merge threshold really low, so like 0.01. So now what that tells me is the object wasn't actually in the center of the world. Let's try object instead and see if that works. Nope. Okay, let's take a look at this. So I'll take a look at this in the front view. Yeah, so you can see the object is slightly off center of the world. So what I would probably want to do is make sure my pivot point for my object, I'll just use the object pivoting point. So I'll just make sure that pivot point for the object is lined up with that center line of my object. I just edited the pivot point so it's lined up with the center of my, that center line of my object, and I go mesh, mirror, no cut geometry. I'm going to change this to object, merge threshold, bring it low like 0.01. And there we go. So that middle line should now be welded together correctly. So my problem with doing this is that anything that crosses across the center line, like this part, and this part, they have mirrored geometry, or they have mirrored UVs. I mean, so do these sides, but you might not notice it. So in general, I think if you can help it, it's better to go ahead and have your UVs not overlapping like this and being mirror identicals to each other, if you can help it. Some cases it's way more useful to do that, just to save time, but in this case I don't think there's really an advantage from this being separate from, or this being the exact mirror copy as this one in terms of UV layout. And so what's happening is those UV shells for both sides are overlapping each other, right? So I can just move them aside. And they're actually kind of flipped too. So if I turn on UV shading, you can see one's blue, which means we're looking at the correct side of it, and the other one is flipped, which is red. So what I do is I'm just going to grab all these guys. I'll go modify layout. So I'm going to open this up. I want to turn off rotate shells because I've oriented my shells correctly, like I'm oriented them according to the texture, and I don't want to ruin that. But I want to go ahead and resize them and rescale them to the correct scale relationship between each other. And when I do this too, it's going to also separate these overlapping shells. So if you don't want to do that and you want to keep the shells overlapped from left side and right side, then do this before you do the mirroring, so that when you do the mirroring, the mirrored side just lay on top of the original side. Click apply. Okay, so when I backed it in. Okay, and so I'll probably want to go ahead and flip these guys. So I'll grab all the ones that are red. So let's go ahead and turn off, so display image, turn off, I'll grab all these ones that are red and flip them. Okay, it goes there backwards. So I'll go modify flip. Okay, and I might probably have to relay this out because they're now overlapping. So modify layout. Oh, I already have it open. Okay, and this piece right here, for instance, does not need to be cut in half, right? It just adds another texture seam I don't need. So I'm just going to go modify, or cut, move in so. Same thing with this piece. Actually, I'll just select this entire center line, and then I'll just go move in so. So that's just going to, all those pieces that got cut in half when I mirrored my object are now welded back together. So once more, with feeling, I'm going to do modify layout. Okay, there we go. Alrighty, so I know these are, this one piece is the one piece I didn't really worry about. So, you know, obviously give it some attention. But now all of my UV shells are oriented the correct way for my texture, right? I mean, ignore the crappy texture map or resolution of the texture map, right? So like those checkerboards are all kind of aligned with the shape. They're all relatively the same size between shells, so that's going to be really nice. Okay, so I'm not going to do the rest of the object just because I think, or the rest of the planks, because I think that's probably redundant. This part up here for this particular team's object is very complicated, so you guys really got to think about how this is constructed. Like, if this is a normal size boat, what I would expect is that you would have this top panel part up here, like this shelf, would be a separate piece of wood. This bottom part would be a separate piece of wood. Even among the shelf, I'd imagine like this length from, let's go ahead and turn off the, there we go. And I'll turn off the texture. So like this length of wood this way, right? And again, let's turn off the shading. There we go. So this length of wood that goes this way, right? Like I'd imagine that as a plank of wood or maybe 2 planks of wood, right? And then up here there'd be a joint that I would weld into, right? And then maybe this region, right? Or maybe that would extend all the way up to here, right? So a plank of wood that goes all the way up to here. And then in between here would be different planks of wood, right? Just like those reference images, we were looking like this one, right? So we have that plank of wood that goes up here, joins there, and then between that we have planks of wood, right? So you need to, it'd be really helpful if you can find like an analog to what you're making here in the reference. But also we have to think about this is a different scale, right? This could be made of popsicle sticks or something like that. So I could see that this could theoretically be made, this whole top part, this top panel part, could be made of a single piece of wood that was like, you carved a hole out of it and shaped down the sides, right? So in the end, you know, you can get away with a lot because of the fact that it's like a little toy boat. So yeah, just make sure, just like I was talking with this one, like that the construction of it makes sense and that wood grain is really going to reveal the construction of your object to the viewer. I want to talk about this rope object for a second. So UV unwrapping things like ropes and complicated coils, you'll have like a repeating rope texture you might want. Let me go ahead and find an example. Okay. So you can see here I just found like a texture I could use for following along this rope. Actually, it turned out like just by default, for some reason it kind of works. I mean, I don't think you should use this because it's kind of broken. Like I can tell if you wanted any type of detail, you can't trust this because this is what those UVs look like, and that obviously is not good. I'm using like a texture like this, right? So it's just like this diagonal texture just to kind of see the pattern. So what I'm going to do is you know, just like with the boat, I'm just going to try to just do a default like, oh, okay. Keep doing that for some reason. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to do create planar. So obviously that doesn't look right. Modify. So I'll go. I need to cut an edge so it can unfold. So clearly, or like easy place to cut an edge is. Let's turn off that texture for a second. Let's go ahead and make sure I have the right one selected, which is this one. Okay, just isolate this one. Okay, so just, you know, this is pretty easy. It's just a cylindrical tube, so I can just find a single edge that goes all the way through it, back around itself, so that's going to be pretty easy to cut. There's this cap I probably want to go ahead and actually, I mean, I probably wouldn't keep any of these like N-gon caps. So either, you know, cut it up into, you know, you're just gonna have to cut it up into a quad somehow. So I'll just delete that for now. So I'll just select an edge loop that goes all the way through. I'll modify or cut, and then go to UV shell. Ignore this guy over here, and these guys also. Select this, modify, unfold. Oh, okay. 1 second, let me pause this. Okay, so you can see here, I had to actually open this in a different version of Maya because the unfold tool in I think 2019, like for certain poly counts, it actually like it only can do like store a certain amount of memory or use a certain amount of memory to do the unfolding before it like gives an error for some reason. So in 2020, it seems like they fixed that, even though some of my tools don't work in 2020, so I switched back to 2019. But anyways, so here's my object right here. So I just did a planar, and then I, you know, if I did an unfold, I, you know, cut an edge, and I went to modify. Let's just go ahead and I'm gonna select it as UVs. So modify, unfold. Okay, you can see it's thinking about it because it's a pretty dense object. Right, and so you can see this is like almost unusable. Like I can't really use this. This is super hard to work with. So we're going to do a trick. And it's a pretty complicated trick, just not, like it's not hard to do, but it's just like logically looking at it, it's like, okay, what the heck are we doing here? Why are we, like, who thought of this originally? Like it's, I don't know, when I first saw it, I thought it was magic. Anyways, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on one of these guys for now. So I'm just going to grab this guy. I might actually separate these. So I'm going to go ahead and go to object mode. I'm just going to go to mesh, separate, and then delete history. I'll combine them back together later. Just because I think it's going to be cleaner and easier to work with just one. Okay. So let's go ahead and so I'll come back in here. So I'll select my mesh, and so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a pretty neat trick. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my UV shell, okay, and then I'm going to go to, let's just grab all of it. I don't even know what this part right over here is, but I'm going to go modify, unitize. What that's going to do is it's actually going to take every single polygon and make it the exact same square, right? So it's everything is as far as the UVs are concerned, every single polygon is straight up and down, left and right. Okay. And also, whenever you're working in UV editor mode, make sure you're in flat shaded mode. If things are going too slow, just press 1 on your keyboard, or not smooth preview mode, because what will happen is it's kind of like it's rendering your object twice, so it's doing, you have twice as many polygons in your scene, so the UV editor can get really slow sometimes if you have smooth preview turned on. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is now I need to stitch all these pieces. So all these pieces are like uniform, rigid little guys. And so now what I need to do is I need to select an edge, or I'm going to essentially stitch it back together, because these are all cut up little individual squares. Now you can see these are all the cut lines, all the ones that are highlighted white, which is everything, which means that the whole object is, individual UV shells. So that's not going to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a single edge loop that goes all the way through, maybe the same one as I had last time, doesn't really matter. So this is the one that's going to stay unwelded, right? Because in order to lay this tube object out, I need to at least have one edge loop cut so it can lay out flat. So I'm going to select that. Now I'm going to go to select inverse. So I'm going to select all my other edges, except for that one that I want to stay unwelded. Okay, I come back in here, and I'll go to cut and sew, and I'm going to do move and sew. Oops. So there's definitely an error somewhere. So let me go ahead and selected something I probably didn't want to select. So let's just double check. Oh, it's probably because of this end cap. So let me go ahead and delete the end cap. So that's complicating things. So let's go back to edge mode. Okay, there we go. So now let's go to modify, or cut and sew, move and sew. So now what's cool is it lines them up as a completely straight grid, right? See that? So it just stitches them all together, but it's not changing the size of any of my squares. So I'm not getting any of the bending, I'm not getting any of the rotating that I was getting of that swirly snake earlier. I can fix this a little bit, right? Because this is going to have a lot of distortion. If I turned on UV distortion, you might not be able to notice it, but yeah, you can see those spots of blue, right? Because not all those polygons are obviously the same size in my image, so, or in my actual 3D scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that off. I can select my UV shell, and then I can go to modify. Actually, let's just go to unfold. So let's just unfold it in the U axis. And I'll process it for a second. Oh, there we go. And then I'm also going to unfold it a little bit in the V axis and see how that works. And that actually went really, really fast. Okay, so this is clearly a really, really big object. So we're probably going to have to like break our rope down a bit, because it's kind of like it's going to be like, in order to fit this in a single UV shell, right? Then, I have to make this really small, which means that it's taking up, let's go ahead and I'll just lay it out in a single UV spot. So you can see I had to get really, really, really small just to fit inside a single UV shell, which isn't going to work, because that means I'm going to have a crazy high texture resolution, right? So this is my texture image. It'd have to be like, I don't know, like 16K just to get pixels over here. So what I'd probably need to do is I'd need to either break it up into separate UDIM tiles, So if you don't know what UDIM tiles is, I'm not going to go over it here, but essentially it's just a way that you can cut up your mesh into multiple texture maps. So different UV shells have different texture maps instead of having to put them all on the same texture map. Let's take a look at that texture I had earlier. So we'll just go ahead and come back out to here, turn on my texture, and oh, I forgot to swap my texture. So let's go ahead and go to object mode, go to my texture, load in the other texture. There we go. Okay, and so you can see that, let's go ahead and grab that texture map. I'm just going to change its size. Okay, so let's just go ahead and set repeat to, I don't know, like 4. So it's going to be like a quarter of the size. So you can see here now that that pattern I created, except for, like, it's not a tileable pattern, so I'd want to make this tileable, so across that UV seam I won't notice it. But you can see that across that whole object, that texture is following the shape of that rope, right? So it's lining up just like our planks with this really complicated object. So this is a really handy way to take something like a really complex laid out rope like this and kind of straighten out the UV so that you can have a repeating pattern that follows along realistically along the whole shape. Okay, so that's pretty much it. If anybody has any questions further regarding UV unwrapping, please let me know.